On the 8th of March, 1994, over 300 people across 42 Michigan counties looked up simultaneously to see cylindrical objects with flickering lights dancing over Lake Michigan, while radar screens confirmed something impossible was happening. The Great Lakes hold more UFO sightings than almost anywhere else in America, from vanishing pilots in the 1,950 seconds to military jets shooting down unknown objects in 2023. Discover the radar confirmations, the physical evidence, the military responses, and the strange science that might explain why these inland seas became America's UFO capital. Journey with me through each lake's most documented encounters. Examine what pilots saw before they disappeared, and uncover why the military takes these sightings seriously enough to scramble fighter jets and fire missiles at objects they cannot identify. Before we begin, settle into this journey wherever you are watching from. Whether you are near these very lakes, across oceans, or anywhere in between, the stories you are about to hear are documented in military files, radar records, and witness testimonies that span 7 decades. These are not simply tales whispered around campfires. These are events that made governments respond, that filled official reports, that left physical evidence, and that continue to this day. The Great Lakes are not ordinary bodies of water. They contain 21% of the world's fresh surface water. They span nearly 95,000 square miles. Their unique geography creates weather patterns found nowhere else on Earth. Cold water beneath warm air, thermal inversions, atmospheric conditions that bend light in ways that can make the impossible appear real and the real appear impossible. But geography and atmospheric science alone cannot explain everything that has happened over these waters. They cannot explain the radar confirmations, they cannot explain the vanished aircraft, they cannot explain why military jets are still being scrambled, still firing missiles, still chasing objects that appear on screens and then vanish without trace. Let us begin where the phenomenon became undeniable, where hundreds of witnesses saw the same thing at the same time, where radar confirmed what eyes reported, where the mystery of the Great Lakes UFO connection crystallized into something that could not be dismissed or ignored. Let us begin with Lake Michigan and the night that changed everything. The 8th of March, 1994, started as an ordinary winter evening across western Michigan. Families were finishing dinner, children were doing homework, the sky was clear, stars visible, temperature hovering just below freezing. Nothing suggested that within hours, police dispatch centers across the state would be overwhelmed with calls, that radar operators would be tracking objects they could not identify, that the next morning newspapers would struggle to explain what hundreds of credible witnesses had seen. The first calls came in around 8:30 in the evening. A woman in Holland, Michigan, reported strange lights over Lake Michigan. Then another call from Grand Haven. Then Muskegon. Then counties further inland. Within an hour, dispatch centers across 42 Michigan counties were receiving reports. Not 1 or 2 calls from confused individuals. Hundreds of calls. Police officers calling in what they were witnessing. Families standing in their yards pointing at the sky. Entire neighborhoods gathering in streets to watch something that should not be there. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Multiple objects in the sky over Lake Michigan. Some witnesses described them as cylindrical, long, and tube-shaped, moving horizontally across the sky. Others reported circular objects, disc-shaped, rotating slowly. But everyone agreed on the lights, flickering, pulsing lights in blue, red, white, and green. Not the steady lights of aircraft, not the blinking pattern of airplanes. These lights pulsed and changed and moved in sequences that seemed deliberate, almost communicative. The objects moved in ways that violated everything people understood about flight. They would hover motionless for minutes, then accelerate to incredible speeds in seconds. They would move in one direction, stop instantly with no deceleration, then move in a completely different direction. They would rise vertically, drop suddenly, perform maneuvers that would destroy any aircraft and kill any pilot. And they made no sound. In the cold March air, sound carries for miles. Jet engines, helicopter rotors, even small propeller planes create noise that cannot be hidden. But these objects, performing impossible maneuvers at various altitudes, produced no sound that any witness could detect. Police officers trained to observe and report were among the most credible witnesses. Officers in multiple counties independently called their dispatchers to report what they were seeing. Some provided minute-by-minute updates as they tracked the objects. Their reports matched civilian accounts. Multiple objects, impossible movements, lights in specific color patterns, no sound, and all of it happening over Lake Michigan, concentrated over the water, occasionally moving inland, but always returning to positions above the lake. But witness testimony, no matter how numerous or credible, can be questioned. People make mistakes. They misidentify Venus or satellites or aircraft. They see what they expect to see. Mass hysteria can affect groups. Skeptics have 100 explanations for why witnesses cannot be trusted, which is why what happened at Muskegon County Airport that night transformed this from an interesting anomaly into something that demanded serious attention. Muskegon County Airport, like all airports, maintains radar coverage of its airspace. Air traffic controllers monitor screens that show every aircraft in the region. They track commercial flights, private planes, anything moving through the sky that might pose a hazard or require guidance. On the night of the 8th of March 1994, the radar operators at Muskegon County Airport were watching their screens when something appeared that should not have been there. The radar return was strong, indicating a solid object or objects of significant size. But the behavior was wrong. The target would appear in one location, remain stationary, then instantly appear miles away, not moving from point A to point B in a way that left a trail on the screen, simply disappearing from one location and reappearing in another. The speed required to make such movements was beyond anything known to aviation. Fighter jets, the fastest aircraft in the sky, cannot move like that. Nothing can move like that. The radar operators documented what they were seeing. They noted the times. They recorded the positions. They filed official reports describing fast-moving phenomena that exhibited erratic movements over Lake Michigan. This was not hysteria. This was not misidentification. This was trained professionals using calibrated equipment designed specifically to detect and track objects in the sky, and that equipment was showing them something that should not exist. The 1,994 Lake Michigan sighting remains one of the most well-documented UFO events in American history. Over 300 witnesses across a wide geographic area, multiple police officers providing independent reports, radar confirmation from airport equipment, all describing the same thing at the same time. And it all happened over Lake Michigan, over the water, in a region that was already developing a dark reputation. Locals call it the Lake Michigan Triangle. The name is deliberate, chosen to evoke comparison with the Bermuda Triangle, and the comparison is not unwarranted. The Lake Michigan Triangle is a roughly defined area stretching between Ludington, Michigan, Benton Harbor, Michigan, and Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Within this triangle, ships have vanished. Aircraft have disappeared. People have gone missing in circumstances that defy explanation. And at the center of it all is deep, cold Lake Michigan, holding its secrets beneath waters that rarely give up their dead. The most famous disappearance in the Lake Michigan Triangle occurred on the 23rd of June 1950. Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 was a Douglas DC-4 aircraft traveling from New York to Seattle with a scheduled stop in Minneapolis. The flight carried 55 passengers and 3 crew members. It was a routine commercial flight, the kind that happened dozens of times every day across America. Weather conditions were noted as favorable. The aircraft was in good condition. The pilots were experienced. Nothing suggested the tragedy that was about to unfold. As Flight 2501 approached Lake Michigan, the pilots requested permission to descend from their assigned altitude of 3,500 feet to 2,500 feet due to an electrical storm in the area. This was a routine request. Air traffic control approved the altitude change. The aircraft continued on its path, flying over the lake, expected to reach the opposite shore and continue toward Minneapolis. At approximately 11:37 p.m., Flight 2501 was over Lake Michigan, somewhere near the midpoint of its crossing. The pilots made a routine position report. Everything was normal. The aircraft was on course, on schedule, experiencing no problems. That transmission was the last anyone ever heard from Flight 2501. When the aircraft failed to arrive at Minneapolis, when radio contact could not be reestablished, when the plane did not appear at any airport in the region, the alarm was raised. A massive search operation began, the largest search in Great Lakes history up to that point. Coast Guard vessels, aircraft, volunteers, everyone who could help scoured the surface of Lake Michigan, looking for wreckage, for survivors, for any sign of what had happened to Flight 2501. Debris was found, small pieces of aircraft, blankets, luggage, a fuel slick on the water. These items confirmed that Flight 2501 had gone down in Lake Michigan. But the main wreckage, the fuselage, the engines, the bodies of the 58 people aboard, none of it was ever found. The lake, despite intensive searching, kept its secrets. The official explanation suggested the aircraft encountered severe turbulence or was struck by lightning, causing it to break apart in midair. But questions remain. Why was no distress call sent? Pilots facing catastrophic failure send Mayday signals. They have time to communicate. Yet Flight 2501 went from a routine position report to complete silence with nothing in between. Why was the main wreckage never located? Lake Michigan is large, but the search area was well defined based on the last known position and the debris field. Modern sonar and underwater search technology have located other wrecks in the Great Lakes. Yet Flight 2501 remains missing, somewhere in the depths, somewhere in the triangle. And Flight 2501 is not alone. The Lake Michigan Triangle has claimed numerous vessels and aircraft. The schooner Thomas Hume vanished in 1891 with 7 crew members, sailing into a storm and never emerging. The schooner Rosabelle disappeared in 1921 with 11 people aboard. Small private aircraft have vanished over the triangle multiple times, their wreckage never found despite searches. Boats have been discovered drifting empty, their crews gone. No signs of struggle or distress, just empty vessels floating on calm water. Then there are the stranger reports. Witnesses describing ships or aircraft that appear on the horizon, clearly visible, then simply vanishing as if they passed through an invisible barrier and ceased to exist. Pilots reporting instrument malfunctions specifically over the triangle, compasses spinning wildly, electronics failing, then everything returning to normal once they exit the area. Sailors describing sudden fogs that appear from nowhere, thick and disorienting, accompanied by a sense of timelessness, of being outside normal space, before the fog lifts and hours have passed that cannot be accounted for. The 1,994 UFO sighting occurred within this triangle, over waters already steeped in mystery and tragedy. The connection is difficult to ignore. Is there something about this specific area of Lake Michigan that creates conditions for unusual phenomena? Is the triangle simply a zone where weather and geography combine to create dangerous conditions that result in accidents? Or is there something more, something that explains not just the disappearances, but the sightings, the radar returns, the objects that 300 people watched dance across the sky? We will return to these questions, but first we must travel to another of the Great Lakes, to an event so recent that its files are still being declassified, to a moment when the United States military made a decision that brought UFOs out of the realm of speculation and into the realm of national security response. We must travel to Lake Huron and the shootdown of 2023. February 2023 was a tense time in North American airspace. Earlier in the month, a Chinese surveillance balloon had been tracked crossing the continental United States, creating a political and military controversy. The balloon was eventually shot down off the coast of South Carolina. But the incident had heightened awareness. Radar operators were watching more carefully. Fighter jets were on higher alert. And in the days following the balloon shootdown, more objects began appearing on radar. Objects that had perhaps always been there but were now being noticed, or objects that represented something new. On the 12th of February 2023, North American Aerospace Defense Command, known as NORAD, detected an unidentified object over Lake Huron. The object was tracked on radar moving at 20,000 feet. This altitude put it squarely in civil aviation airspace. Commercial aircraft fly at these altitudes. Passenger jets filled with hundreds of people cross the Great Lakes at 20,000 feet. An unidentified object, especially one exhibiting unusual flight characteristics, represented a potential collision hazard. The military response was swift and unprecedented. An F-16 fighter jet was scrambled from an Air National Guard base. The pilot was vectored toward the object's last known position over Lake Huron. And then, on direct orders that came from the chain of command extending to President Joe Biden himself, the decision was made to engage. The F-16 pilot achieved lock on the target. The fire command was given. A missile launched from the fighter jet, its exhaust trail visible in the cold February air. The missile, designed to destroy enemy aircraft, guided itself toward the unidentified object. And then, somewhere over Lake Huron, the missile struck its target. The Pentagon confirmed the shootdown within hours. Press briefings acknowledged that an unidentified object had been destroyed over Lake Huron, but details were scarce. What exactly had been shot down? Where did it come from? What was its purpose? These questions went initially unanswered, classified, buried in military files marked with security designations that prevented public disclosure. The object was described in the limited information released as octagonal in shape, not a sphere like a balloon, not cylindrical like a conventional aircraft. Octagonal, 8-sided. A geometry unusual for any normal aerial object. It was unmanned, containing no pilot or crew. It was flying at 20,000 feet, high enough to be a hazard, but low enough to be within range of ground-based observation if anyone had been looking in the right place at the right time. For months, the Lake Huron shootdown remained mysterious. Speculation ran wild. Was it another surveillance device from a foreign power? Was it some kind of experimental technology? Was it something that had no conventional explanation? The military silence only fed the questions. Then, in 2024, more than a year after the incident, documents began to be released. Freedom of Information Act requests, journalistic investigations, and eventual declassification revealed more details. Debris had been recovered from Lake Huron. Teams had been sent to retrieve what remained after the missile strike. The pieces had been analyzed, and the conclusion reached by investigators was that the object likely originated from a commercial company that manufactured weather monitoring equipment. Weather balloons and monitoring equipment are launched regularly. They carry instruments to measure atmospheric conditions, wind speed, temperature, pressure. They are usually small, designed to ascend to high altitudes and then descend after collecting data. They are supposed to be tracked, their flight paths coordinated with aviation authorities to prevent exactly the kind of incident that occurred over Lake Huron. But questions remain even with this explanation. If the object was commercial weather equipment, why was it octagonal? Weather balloons are spherical. Monitoring packages are usually cylindrical or cubic for aerodynamic reasons. Why was it at 20,000 feet in civil aviation airspace without proper coordination? Why did military radar operators, trained to identify conventional aircraft and known aerial objects, classify it as unidentified? Why did the decision chain go all the way to presidential authorization for a shootdown if this was simply a misplaced weather balloon? The official explanation fits some of the facts but leaves others unexplained, and the Lake Huron shootdown was not an isolated incident. In the days surrounding the 12th of February 2023, additional objects were shot down over Alaska and Canada. The military was responding to a wave of unidentified aerial phenomena, a sudden surge of objects appearing on radar that did not match known patterns. Some analysts suggest that the Chinese balloon incident caused radar operators to adjust their filters to look for smaller or slower objects that might previously have been screened out. In other words, these objects may have always been there, drifting through our skies unnoticed, until we started paying attention. Others suggest something changed in February 2023, that more objects were actually present, that something triggered an increase in activity. Whatever the truth, the Lake Huron shootdown represents a turning point. The United States military fired a missile at an unidentified object over the Great Lakes. This is not speculation, this is not folklore. This is documented military action in response to something in the sky that could not be immediately identified. and it happened over Lake Huron, one of the 5 Great Lakes that have been associated with strange aerial phenomena for decades. Lake Huron is the second largest of the Great Lakes by surface area. Its waters are cold and deep, reaching depths of 750 feet in some locations. Its shoreline is dotted with islands, bays, and channels that have witnessed centuries of maritime traffic. And among those centuries of history are incidents that echo with the same mysteries we find across all the Great Lakes. But one incident stands above the rest. An incident so strange, so thoroughly documented, and so completely unsolved that it remains one of aviation's greatest mysteries. The Kinross incident of 1953. The 23rd of November 1953, Kinross Air Force Base, located in Michigan's Upper Peninsula near the shore of Lake Superior. The base was operational during the Cold War, home to fighter squadrons responsible for air defense of the northern United States and the Great Lakes region. Tensions were high in 1953. The Korean War had recently ended. The Cold War with the Soviet Union was intensifying. Any unidentified aircraft in American airspace was treated as a potential threat. On that November evening, radar operators at Kinross Air Force Base detected an unidentified return over Lake Superior. The object was moving, but its characteristics did not match any known aircraft. The decision was made to scramble an interceptor to investigate, to identify the unknown target, and if necessary, to respond to a threat. First Lieutenant Felix Moncla was the pilot assigned to the mission. He was an experienced Air Force pilot, trained in interception procedures, capable of handling the F-89 Scorpion jet that would carry him toward whatever was out there over the lake. Second Lieutenant Robert Wilson accompanied him as the radar operator, responsible for guiding Moncla toward the target and operating the aircraft's weapon systems if engagement became necessary. The F-89 Scorpion was a 2-seat, twin-engine jet fighter designed specifically for all-weather interception. It was equipped with radar, missiles, and sophisticated navigation systems for its era. It was a capable aircraft flown by trained military personnel responding to a routine scramble order. There was no reason to think this mission would be anything other than standard. Moncla and Wilson took off from Kinross Air Force Base and headed toward the last known position of the unidentified radar return over Lake Superior. Ground controllers watched their radar screens, tracking both the F-89 and the unknown object. They maintained radio contact with Moncla, providing updates on the target's position, guiding him through the interception. The 2 radar blips moved closer together on the screens at Kinross. Moncla was closing on the unknown object, following his orders, approaching the target to achieve visual identification. The ground controllers watched as the distance between the 2 blips decreased. 5 miles, 3 miles, 1 mile. Moncla was reporting his position, confirming he was tracking the target, and then something happened that no one could explain. On the radar screens at Kinross Air Force Base, the 2 blips, one representing Moncla's F-89 and one representing the unknown object, merged. They became a single radar return. The controllers waited for Moncla to report visual contact, to identify what he was intercepting, but no report came. The radio was silent, and then the single merged radar blip disappeared. Both returns vanished from the screen simultaneously. The controllers tried to re-establish radio contact. They called Moncla repeatedly. No response. They searched the area with radar, looking for the F-89's return. Nothing. They checked with other radar stations, thinking perhaps there was an equipment malfunction, but the other stations confirmed it. The aircraft had disappeared. Moncla and Wilson were gone. Search and rescue operations began immediately. Coast Guard vessels, aircraft, and Canadian forces joined the search. Lake Superior is vast and deep, but the area where the disappearance occurred was well defined based on the radar data. Searchers scoured the water and the shoreline looking for wreckage, for debris, for any sign of the F-89 or its crew. Nothing was ever found. Not a piece of the aircraft, not a life raft, not a seat cushion or fuel slick. No bodies, no wreckage. Moncla and Wilson, along with their F-89 Scorpion jet, had simply vanished over Lake Superior as completely as if they had never existed. The Air Force opened an investigation. They needed to explain what had happened to an interceptor aircraft and two trained pilots. The official conclusion stated that Moncla had been vectored to intercept a Canadian Air Force C-47 aircraft that had been off course. The report suggested that Moncla became disoriented, descended too low over the lake in bad weather, and crashed into the water. Equipment failure or pilot error caused the accident, and the deep, cold water of Lake Superior prevented recovery of the wreckage. But this explanation has problems, significant problems that have prevented it from being accepted by researchers and by the families of the missing men. First, Canadian authorities stated unequivocally that no C-47 or any Canadian military aircraft was in the area at the time of the incident. The Canadian Air Force kept meticulous records. They knew where their planes were, and none of them were over Lake Superior when Moncla disappeared. Second, the weather was not particularly bad that night. Visibility was reasonable. Moncla was an experienced pilot flying an aircraft designed for all-weather operation. While accidents happen, the scenario of an experienced pilot in a capable aircraft simply flying into the lake makes little sense given the conditions and circumstances. Third, and most disturbing, is the radar data. The ground controllers watched the two blips merge and then vanish, not one blip disappearing while the other continued. Both disappeared simultaneously from the same location. If Moncla had crashed while pursuing another aircraft, his blip would have vanished while the other continued. But that is not what happened. Both vanished together, at the same moment, from the same point. The Kinross incident remains unsolved. Moncla and Wilson are still listed as missing. Their families never received closure. And Lake Superior, which rarely gives up its dead due to the extreme cold that prevents bodies from surfacing, holds whatever remains of the F-89 somewhere in its depths. Over the decades, various theories have emerged. Some suggest the unknown object was a Soviet aircraft testing American air defenses, and that Moncla was shot down in an undisclosed Cold War engagement. But no evidence supports this. No Soviet records have emerged. No wreckage has ever been found. Others suggest something far stranger, that Moncla and Wilson encountered something that was not a conventional aircraft at all. That the object they were intercepting was exactly what it appeared to be on radar, unidentified. And that the merger of the two radar blips represents not a collision but something else, something that sounds like science fiction but for which the radar data provides uncomfortable support, an absorption, a capture. Moncla and Wilson flying into or being taken by whatever they were chasing. This explanation sounds absurd until you consider that we have no other explanation that fits the facts. No wreckage, no bodies, no confirmed identity of what Moncla was chasing. Just two radar returns merging and vanishing, and two men who never came home. Lake Superior keeps its secrets as well as any ocean. Its depths are cold enough to preserve a human body indefinitely. Its size makes searching for a specific wreckage site nearly impossible without precise location data, and the water itself seems to resist giving up what it has taken. But the disappearance of Felix Moncla and Robert Wilson stands as one of the Great Lakes' darkest mysteries, a military incident with documentation and radar data that cannot be explained away, cannot be dismissed, and cannot be solved with the information available. Now we must turn to the lake with the most consistent, most frequent, and most bizarre UFO activity. We must turn to Lake Erie, the shallowest and most temperamental of the Great Lakes, and the body of water that researchers call simply the UFO hotspot. Lake Erie differs from its sister lakes in important ways. It is the shallowest, with an average depth of only 62 feet, though it does contain areas that drop to over 200 feet. It is the warmest, its waters heating quickly in summer and cooling rapidly in winter. Its weather is notoriously unpredictable. Calm conditions can turn to dangerous storms in minutes. And it has, consistently over decades, produced more UFO reports per square mile than any other Great Lake. The concentration of sightings over Lake Erie is not a modern phenomenon. Reports date back decades, but they increased in frequency starting in the 1,980 seconds and have continued steadily into the present. Witnesses describe objects emerging from the water, hovering above the surface, moving at incredible speeds and performing maneuvers that defy conventional physics. And many of these witnesses are trained observers whose careers depend on accurate reporting. One of the most significant Lake Erie UFO incidents occurred in March 1988. The witness was a Coast Guard crew, multiple trained personnel whose job involves constant observation of the lake, the sky, and anything that might represent a hazard or require assistance. These are not people prone to flights of fancy. These are professionals who understand aircraft, weather phenomena, and normal lake activity. On the night in question, the Coast Guard personnel observed a large craft over Lake Erie. The object was massive, far larger than any conventional aircraft. It displayed lights that strobed in multiple colors, cycling through patterns in red, blue, white, and green. The object was not simply flying over the lake, it was descending, lowering itself toward the frozen surface. Lake Erie was ice-covered. It was winter, and the surface had frozen solid in many areas. The Coast Guard crew watched as the large craft approached the ice and then landed, not crashed, not descended out of control. It landed deliberately on the frozen surface of Lake Erie. What happened next was documented in the official Coast Guard report. Smaller objects emerged from the larger craft. These secondary objects flew out, described as moving independently, maneuvering around the area, and then returning to the main craft. The entire event lasted long enough for the Coast Guard personnel to observe, discuss what they were seeing, and file a detailed report. But perhaps most disturbing was the sound. The landing caused a rumbling in the ice. The witnesses described feeling and hearing the ice respond to whatever had landed on it, a deep vibration that traveled through the frozen surface and could be detected on shore. This was not a visual phenomenon only. This was something physical, something with mass and presence that interacted with the environment in measurable ways. After some time, the smaller objects returned to the main craft. The entire thing lifted off from the ice, ascended rapidly, and vanished from sight, accelerating to speeds that left the witnesses stunned and without adequate words to describe what they had observed. The Coast Guard filed an official report. This documentation is important. Military and Coast Guard personnel are required to report unusual incidents. These reports become part of permanent records. They are not casual accounts shared socially. They are official documents that become part of service files. The 1988 Lake Erie incident is not urban legend. It is documented Coast Guard testimony describing a craft landing on ice, deploying smaller objects, and then departing. This incident is far from the only Lake Erie UFO report. Residents along the shoreline, particularly in the areas around Cleveland and the lake's central basin, report frequent sightings. Some witnesses describe objects that appear nightly during certain time periods, emerging from the same location, performing similar patterns of movement, and then submerging or departing. The consistency of the reports is striking. Multiple independent witnesses separated by time and location describe similar objects. Large craft with multicolored lights, smaller objects that appear to be deployed from or associated with the larger craft. Movement patterns that involve hovering, rapid acceleration, instant direction changes, and speeds that exceed anything conventional. And many reports describe objects entering or emerging from the water itself, suggesting that whatever is being seen has a relationship with the lake, not just the airspace above it. Amateur researchers and UFO enthusiasts have conducted skywatch events on Lake Erie. Groups gather at known hotspot locations with cameras, binoculars, and recording equipment. Many of these watches result in documented sightings, videos and photographs showing lights over the lake, objects that maneuver in ways that challenge conventional explanation, and phenomena that occur with sufficient frequency that watchers can predict when and where activity is most likely. Skeptics point out that Lake Erie is bordered by major cities, airports, and military installations. Cleveland Hopkins International Airport is nearby. There are military facilities in the region. Conventional aircraft are constantly in the sky. What witnesses interpret as UFOs might be military exercises, commercial flights seen from unusual angles, or misidentified conventional phenomena. But this skepticism struggles to account for certain aspects of the Lake Erie reports. Why do Coast Guard personnel, trained to identify aircraft and maritime activity, file reports of objects they cannot identify? Why do the reports describe objects entering and emerging from water, a behavior no aircraft exhibits? Why do multiple witnesses separated by years describe identical characteristics, the multicolored strobing lights, the large craft with smaller deployed objects, the incredible speeds and instant direction changes? Lake Erie's reputation as a UFO hotspot is established enough that it attracts researchers from around the world. The lake has been featured in documentaries, investigated by civilian UFO research organizations, and studied by individuals trying to determine whether the concentration of sightings represents genuine anomalous activity or simply a combination of geography, weather, and human psychology. What makes Lake Erie particularly interesting is the sheer number of credible witnesses, not just casual observers, but trained personnel, Coast Guard crews, commercial pilots who fly over the lake regularly, law enforcement officers, ship captains. These are people whose livelihoods depend on accurate observation and reporting. They understand the difference between an airplane and something unexplained. And many of them have come forward, often reluctantly and at risk to their professional reputations, to report what they have seen over Lake Erie. The lake's shallow depth compared to the other Great Lakes might be relevant. If objects are entering and emerging from the water, Lake Erie's relative shallowness might make such activity more visible or more frequent. The warm water temperatures in summer could create thermal conditions that affect both atmospheric phenomena and the behavior of any objects in or above the water. The lake's position, surrounded by major population centers, means that more people are watching at any given time, increasing the likelihood that unusual activity will be observed and reported. But none of these factors fully explain the Lake Erie phenomenon. They might contribute to the number of reports, but they do not explain the content of those reports. They do not explain the Coast Guard documentation. They do not explain why multiple witnesses describe objects that behave in identical ways. They do not explain the physical evidence like the rumbling ice or the radar confirmations that sometimes accompany the visual sightings. Lake Erie remains active. Reports continue to be filed, witnesses continue to come forward. And the question remains unanswered. What is happening over and in the waters of Lake Erie? What are trained observers seeing that resists conventional explanation? And why does this particular Great Lake produce such consistent, such frequent, and such bizarre UFO activity? We must now examine an incident that occurred not directly over the Great Lakes, but near enough to be considered part of the broader regional phenomenon. An incident that provided physical evidence, medical documentation, and testimony from a witness who suffered real, measurable harm from an encounter with something that should not exist. We must examine the Falcon Lake incident of 1967. Falcon Lake is located in Manitoba, Canada, not far from the Great Lakes region. The incident occurred on the 20th of May 1967 when a man named Stefan Michalak was prospecting for minerals near the lake. Michalak was an industrial mechanic, a practical man with technical knowledge, not someone prone to fantasy or attention-seeking behavior. He was alone in the wilderness, searching for quartz and silver, when he noticed something in the sky. Two glowing objects descended from the clouds. Michalak watched as they approached. One object hovered briefly, then ascended back into the clouds and disappeared. The other object landed on a flat rock outcropping approximately 160 feet from where Michalak was standing. The object was disc-shaped, approximately 40 feet in diameter. It glowed with an intense red color that gradually shifted to gray as it cooled after landing. Michalak observed the craft for approximately 30 minutes. He heard sounds from inside, voices or mechanical noises, though he could not determine which. A door opened in the side of the craft, and Michalak, curious and perhaps foolishly brave, approached. He looked inside the opening and saw a maze of lights, panels, and what appeared to be a complex interior. He called out, thinking perhaps this was some kind of experimental American aircraft and that the occupants might need assistance. No one responded. The door suddenly closed. And then, as Michalak stood close to the craft, it began to move. A panel on the side of the object opened, revealing a grid pattern of holes. From these holes, a blast of hot gas or air erupted directly at Michalak. The force knocked him backward. The heat ignited his shirt and undershirt. He tore at his burning clothes as the craft ascended rapidly and vanished into the sky. Michalak was hurt. The blast had struck him in the chest. He made his way back to his motel, but by the time he arrived, he was suffering severe symptoms: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, intense pain. He was hospitalized, and when doctors examined him, they found something that could not be easily explained away. On Michalak's chest was a pattern of burns. Not random burns, not the kind of burns you receive from fire or heat exposure. These were precise, geometric burns arranged in a grid pattern that exactly matched the holes he described seeing on the craft. The burns were documented by multiple doctors, photographs were taken, medical reports were filed. This was physical evidence, injury, harm caused by something that left a specific, measurable mark. The burn pattern consisted of circular marks arranged in a grid, dots forming lines across Michalak's chest and stomach. The pattern was consistent with his description of what he saw on the craft. The burns were severe enough to require medical treatment and left permanent scarring. This was not a case of a witness claiming to see something with no supporting evidence. This was a man with documented injuries that corresponded exactly to his account of what happened. Investigations followed. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigated. The Canadian Department of National Defence sent personnel to the site. Radioactivity was detected at the landing location, though at low levels. Soil samples showed unusual properties. Michalak's clothing was analyzed and showed evidence of exposure to radiation. Michalak never sought publicity. He never tried to profit from his experience. In fact, the incident caused him significant hardship. He suffered health problems for months afterward. He was ridiculed by some media outlets, and he consistently maintained the same account of what happened, never changing his story, never embellishing, simply stating what he experienced. The Falcon Lake incident is considered one of the best documented UFO cases in history because of the physical evidence, the burns, the radiation, the medical documentation, the investigation by official authorities, and Michalak's consistency and credibility as a witness. It stands as proof that something happened, something that caused real harm, something that left marks that cannot be explained by conventional means. The incident's proximity to the Great Lakes region, combined with its physical evidence, makes it relevant to our broader examination. The Great Lakes UFO phenomenon is not just about lights in the sky. It is about objects that interact with the environment, that leave evidence, that affect people in measurable ways. And the Falcon Lake incident demonstrates that whatever is being encountered, whether over the lakes themselves or in the surrounding region, is capable of causing physical harm. Now, we must turn to a scientific explanation that many researchers believe accounts for a significant portion of Great Lakes UFO sightings. We must examine Fata Morgana, an atmospheric optical phenomenon that can create illusions so convincing that even trained observers can be fooled. Understanding Fata Morgana is essential to understanding the Great Lakes UFO mystery because it demonstrates how legitimate sightings of extraordinary objects can have mundane explanations rooted in physics and atmospheric science. A Fata Morgana is a complex form of superior mirage. Mirages are familiar to most people. The shimmering water that appears on hot roads is a mirage, caused by light bending through layers of air at different temperatures. But Fata Morgana mirages are far more sophisticated and far more deceptive. The phenomenon requires specific atmospheric conditions. Cold water beneath warm air creates temperature inversions, layers of air at different temperatures, stacked vertically. Light traveling through these layers bends and refracts according to the temperature gradients. Under the right conditions, this refraction can produce images of objects that are actually below the horizon, making them appear in the sky. Over the Great Lakes, these conditions are common. The lakes are cold. The air temperature varies significantly with altitude and season. Temperature inversions occur regularly, especially during spring and fall when the difference between water temperature and air temperature is most pronounced. When a Fata Morgana forms over the Great Lakes, it can take distant objects, boats, shorelines, structures, and project them into the sky in distorted, unrecognizable forms. Imagine a bent mirror placed above the surface of the water. This mirror captures images of things below the horizon and throws them upward into the sky. But because the mirror is bent and constantly shifting as the atmospheric layers move and change temperature, the images are distorted. A boat becomes an elongated column. A shoreline becomes a floating structure. Distant buildings become hovering geometric shapes. And because the atmospheric conditions are constantly changing, these images move, they flicker, they appear and disappear. They seem to defy physics because they are not real objects. They are projections, images bent through atmospheric lenses that shift and change moment by moment. Fata Morgana mirages can appear extraordinarily convincing. They can produce images that look solid and three-dimensional. They can create the appearance of objects hovering in midair. They can make things appear to move at impossible speeds because the movement is not of the object itself but of the atmospheric lens projecting its image. And they often produce multiple images, stacked vertically, as different temperature layers refract light at different angles. The color patterns reported in many UFO sightings can be explained by Fata Morgana. Navigation lights on boats, red and green and white, become the flickering multicolored lights on a UFO when projected through atmospheric distortion. The lights seem to pulse and change because the atmospheric lens is constantly shifting, sometimes magnifying the light, sometimes diminishing it, sometimes splitting it into multiple images. Lake Ontario, in particular, has been identified as a location where Fata Morgana mirages are frequent. The lake's orientation, its temperature patterns, and its surrounding geography create ideal conditions. Researchers studying UFO reports from Lake Ontario have found strong correlations between sighting dates and times when atmospheric conditions favored Fata Morgana formation. But while Fata Morgana explains many sightings, it does not explain all of them. It does not explain radar confirmations, like the 1994 Lake Michigan event. Radar does not see optical illusions. Radar detects physical objects by bouncing radio waves off solid surfaces. If an object appears on radar, something solid is there. A mirage cannot create a radar return. Fata Morgana does not explain cases where witnesses are close to the objects. Mirages occur at a distance. They project images of things beyond the horizon. If you are close enough to an object to observe detail, close enough to hear sounds, close enough to be affected by heat or force, you are not observing a mirage. You are observing something real. And Fata Morgana certainly does not explain physical evidence like the burns on Stefan Michalak's chest or the objects shot down by military jets. Mirages do not land on ice. Mirages do not require missile strikes. Mirages do not leave physical evidence. So we are left with a complex picture. Some Great Lakes UFO sightings are likely Fata Morgana mirages, optical illusions created by atmospheric conditions that are common over these cold waters. These sightings involve distant objects, flickering lights, shapes that defy easy description, and behavior that seems to violate physics because the images are projections through shifting atmospheric lenses. But other sightings resist this explanation. Cases with radar confirmation, cases with multiple witnesses at different locations simultaneously, cases where objects are observed at close range, cases involving physical evidence or military response. These cannot be dismissed as atmospheric phenomena. The Great Lakes UFO mystery exists at the intersection of explainable and unexplainable. Some sightings have prosaic explanations. Weather balloons, aircraft, satellites, planets, atmospheric optical illusions, but a residue remains, cases that do not fit, evidence that resists conventional explanation. Patterns that suggest something more than misidentification and atmospheric tricks. The military takes this seriously. The 2023 Lake Huron shootdown proves that. The government scrambled a fighter jet and fired a missile at something in the sky over the Great Lakes. That is not a response to a known weather balloon or an obvious atmospheric phenomenon. That is a response to something unidentified, something that posed enough concern to justify the expense and risk of military engagement. The 1994 Lake Michigan mass sighting involved radar confirmation and hundreds of witnesses. That is not a case of a few people misidentifying Venus. That is a widespread event with technological corroboration. The Kinross incident involved trained military pilots disappearing while intercepting an unknown object. That is not a simple accident or navigation error. That is an unsolved disappearance with radar data that shows something impossible: two objects merging and vanishing simultaneously. The Coast Guard report from Lake Erie described a craft landing on ice and deploying smaller objects. That is not a report filed by confused civilians. That is official documentation from trained observers describing something that exhibited physical presence and caused measurable effects. The Falcon Lake incident provided physical evidence in the form of geometric burns, radiation exposure, and medical documentation. That is not a case that can be dismissed as hallucination or hoax. That is a man injured by something that left specific, measurable marks corresponding exactly to his testimony. These cases, and dozens more like them across the Great Lakes region, form a pattern. Not every sighting is legitimate. Not every report is accurate. But the sheer volume of reports, combined with the quality of some witnesses and the existence of physical and technological evidence in certain cases, suggests that something is happening over the Great Lakes that defies easy categorization. Why the Great Lakes? What is it about these specific bodies of water that concentrates this phenomenon? Several factors may contribute. Geography and weather play roles. The Great Lakes create unique atmospheric conditions. Temperature inversions, fata morgana mirages, unusual weather patterns, all of these occur more frequently over the lakes than over land. These conditions might not cause UFO activity, but they might make such activity more visible or more frequently reported. The population density around the Great Lakes is significant. Millions of people live along the shores. Major cities cluster around the lakes. More people watching the sky means more potential witnesses. An event that might go unobserved over a remote ocean could be seen by dozens or hundreds of people over the Great Lakes simply because so many people are present. Military presence is another factor. The Great Lakes region contains numerous military installations, Air Force bases, Coast Guard stations, radar facilities. These installations monitor the airspace constantly. They detect things that civilian observers might miss. And when something unusual appears, the military has the resources to respond, which might explain incidents like the Lake Huron shootdown and the Kinross interception. But perhaps the most intriguing possibility is that the Great Lakes themselves are relevant, not as landmarks or geographic features, but as locations of interest. If the UFO phenomenon, whatever it ultimately is, involves entities or technologies that have interest in Earth's water resources, the Great Lakes would be logical focal points. They contain 21% of the world's fresh surface water. They are massive, deep, and relatively remote in their central areas. They offer possibilities for submersion, for concealment, for operations beneath the surface where human observation is minimal. The consistency of reports describing objects entering and emerging from the water supports this possibility. Multiple independent witnesses across different lakes and different time periods describe craft submerging into the water or rising from beneath the surface. These reports span decades. They come from credible observers, and they suggest a relationship between the phenomenon and the water itself, not just the airspace above it. If objects are capable of operating underwater, the Great Lakes provide excellent operating environments. They are deep enough for concealment, particularly Lake Superior with its depths exceeding 1,000 feet. They are remote enough in their centers that surface activity might go unobserved, and they connect to the ocean via the St. Lawrence Seaway, providing a route to and from the Atlantic. This speculation ventures into territory that science cannot currently address. We have no proof of underwater bases or submerged craft. We have no evidence that the UFO phenomenon has specific interest in freshwater versus saltwater, but the reports exist, the patterns exist. And they suggest possibilities that, while extraordinary, attempt to explain why the Great Lakes have become so strongly associated with UFO activity. Another possibility is simply that the Great Lakes are convenient landmarks. If unidentified objects are navigating or operating in North America, the Great Lakes are massive, easily identifiable geographic features. They would serve as navigation references, as waypoints, as locations that could be easily located and returned to. This would explain why multiple sightings occur in the same areas repeatedly. Not because something is based there, but because those locations serve functional purposes for whatever is being observed. The truth is, we do not know. Despite decades of sightings, despite military investigations, despite physical evidence in some cases, we still cannot definitively explain what is happening over the Great Lakes. We have pieces of the puzzle. We have atmospheric science that explains some sightings. We have documented cases that resist conventional explanation. We have patterns that suggest genuine anomalous activity. But we do not have answers. What we have instead is a mystery that persists across decades. A mystery that involves credible witnesses, technological confirmation in multiple cases, physical evidence in rare but important incidents, and military responses that indicate official concern. The Great Lakes UFO phenomenon is real in the sense that the reports are real, the witnesses are real, and the effects, whether psychological, social, or in rare cases physical, are real. Whether the objects themselves are real in the sense of being physical craft from unknown origins, or whether they represent a complex mix of misidentification, atmospheric phenomena, and a small core of genuinely unexplained events, remains uncertain. Different researchers reach different conclusions based on the same evidence. Skeptics emphasize the explainable cases and suggest the unexplained ones simply lack sufficient information for conventional explanation. Believers emphasize the unexplained cases and suggest they represent something genuinely anomalous. Most people fall somewhere between these extremes. They acknowledge that many UFO reports have prosaic explanations. They understand that human perception is fallible and that we see what we expect to see. But they also recognize that a residue of cases exists that resists dismissal, that challenges conventional explanation, that suggests something strange is occurring even if we cannot yet determine what that something is. The Great Lakes will continue to generate reports. Witnesses will continue to come forward. Some sightings will be explained, others will remain mysterious. The military will continue to monitor the airspace and will respond when objects appear that cannot be immediately identified. Researchers will continue to investigate, to document, to analyze, and the mystery will persist. On cold, clear nights, people still stand on the shores of the Great Lakes and look up. They watch the sky. They wonder about the lights they see. And sometimes, they witness something that challenges their understanding, that makes them question what they thought they knew about reality. The Great Lakes are more than just bodies of water. They are landscapes of mystery. They hold beneath their surfaces the wreckage of ships and aircraft that vanished without explanation. They generate atmospheric conditions that can fool the eyes and create illusions. They are monitored by military radar that detects objects we cannot identify. And they are watched by millions of people who occasionally see things that should not be there. Why the Great Lakes became linked to UFO stories is a question with multiple answers. Geography, weather, population density, military presence, atmospheric science, and perhaps, just perhaps, something more. Something that we do not yet understand. Something that appears on radar and in the sky. Something that credible witnesses report with consistency. Something that occasionally leaves evidence. Something that makes the military scramble jets and fire missiles. The phenomenon persists, the reports continue, the mystery remains. And over the cold waters of the Great Lakes, beneath the stars and the shifting lights of the aurora, in the places where atmosphere plays tricks, and where trained observers sometimes see things they cannot explain, the possibility lingers. The possibility that we are not alone, that we are observed, that the skies above these inland seas hold secrets we have barely begun to uncover. The Great Lakes watch, the radar screens track, the witnesses report, and the question remains unanswered, hanging in the air like the objects themselves, present but unexplained, real but undefined, challenging us to look up, to watch, to wonder, and to admit that despite our technology and our understanding, there are still things in our skies and over our waters that we cannot fully explain. This is why the Great Lakes became linked to UFO stories. Not because of a single incident or a simple explanation, but because of a complex accumulation of sightings, evidence, patterns, and mysteries that span decades and resist easy resolution. The Great Lakes UFO phenomenon is a puzzle with some pieces that fit clearly and others that do not fit at all, leaving us with an incomplete picture that suggests something extraordinary while withholding final proof. The waters remain, the sightings continue, and the mystery endures. Add to conversation.